Hey everyone, this is Ryan Bush. Alright, so today I'm going to let y'all know of a change that I am making to a story, a Barry's Boys episode, and it has to do with Butch Davis's role with the Cowboys in 1994. And to explain this, I'm going to come around the horn a little bit. I'm going to take just a little bit of time to explain a few things that I deal with when researching that, maybe a lot of researchers deal with. It just seems like a good time to explain a few things. And I'm going to start with a comment on my video that I dealt with a couple of days ago. I didn't deal with it in this regard, though. I didn't take it this down this path. But I want to explain something. So in this comment, this person talks about a story that Mike Fisher broke dealing with Jimmy Johnson and Wayne Weaver and how supposedly Jimmy did such and such things wrong. He went behind Norv Turner's back. He didn't help Norv Turner get the job. Basically, he did this and that. I want to deal with a couple of things. So when I come across a story like this, there is a context even to the writer. Consider the story, but there's a writer angle to this. And what I mean is that in Dallas at the time, in the DFW Metroplex, among sports writers, there was a battle going on in the early 90s for preeminence, if you will. The Dallas Morning News was the big dog, okay? They had all the major writers. They had Randy Galloway. They had Blackie Sherrod. If you remember the Dallas Morning News back then, they were not totally, but there was an anti-Jerry slant, okay? Randy Galloway was the smart aleck in the room. He took the anti-Jerry angle. Frank Luxa could at times. On Sunday, he was more the balanced guy. He could be a little more balanced in his analysis. Ed Werder was the beat writer who didn't always buy the Jerry angle. But, when it comes to sales back then, Dallas Morning News was way ahead of their closest competitor, which was the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Now, Mike Fisher wrote for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. That paper was desperate to get any leg up and break any story that the Morning News somehow missed. And Fisher back then was prone to accept anything that the Jerry Jones camp had. Because at the time, there was a war between Jimmy Johnson and Jerry Jones going on. And the camps used the media to wage some of this war. And Fisher, he tended to accept whatever sources from the Jerry Jones camp whatever stories they were feeding him. And this is just a fact of life back then. It doesn't mean all his stories were wrong. It doesn't mean everything in his stories were wrong. Plenty of his stories were 100% right. I got no problem with. But you had to watch out and understand what was going on. And you might ask, why would a newspaper or a individual reporter sell themselves out like this? And the simple answer is business. It's for survival. You need a good source. You need a high-ranking source within whatever team you're covering to help you keep up with the team's daily movements and so forth. And sometimes you have to sacrifice. You don't have to, but sometimes reporters and newspapers sacrifice a little bit of truth and maybe a little bit of long-term credibility in order to stay afloat, because it is a dog-eat-dog world. Let's not pretend that it isn't. And sometimes there are sacrifices and compromises made in this department. Now, I'll say this too. I'm not saying that every story that the Dallas Morning News ever wrote was 100% correct. I'm not saying that, but understand that the Star-Telegram and their writers were waging a war. They were a little bit more desperate. They weren't so they didn't feel so compelled to cross all their T's and dot all their I's in some of these stories. So one of their sources says that Jerry Jones says that Jimmy Johnson did such with Wayne Weaver with the Jaguars. Hey, let's go ahead and print that because I haven't seen that in the morning news. Let's get it out there and get a little bit of get a little bump in sales. And kind of a frequent thing going on. You had during the mid-90s, you also had Skip Bayless, who became a free agent and was doing his sports paper. It was through faxing. He was faxing to his subscribers. He was kind of a wild card, but he was more in line with accepting the Jerry Jones angle of things. And so what you have in the story is this going on, okay, with the Jimmy Johnson and the Jaguars. And it's easy to see certain things. Jimmy did not just ignore this query about Norv Turner. He didn't just, when Wayne Weaver supposedly asked him about Norv Turner's qualifications for head coach, he did not just say, he did just bypass the question and immediately throw his hat in the ring and sell himself. That's not what happened, even though the story from Fisher suggests it. That's not what happened, okay? There was never any indication within the Norv Turner-Jimmy Johnson relationship that it had happened. Norv Turner and Jimmy always got along. Jimmy didn't try to prevent Turner from getting a promotion in his career, taking the next step, becoming a head coach. I mean, to do that would be totally opposite of everything that Jimmy Johnson has ever done before and done after. Jimmy was always about helping his assistants make it. You know, he wanted his assistants to do well. He cheered for them. That's just the way he was built. What is interesting about this, okay, is that the fact that the story was ever broken in the first place. Wayne Weaver wasn't in a position he didn't need to get anybody upset. He's the incoming owner. He's just trying to do a little business here, okay? I don't believe that the story was broke from his angle. Now, I do believe that Jimmy did this, and he did this with Wayne Weaver to get Jerry's dander up. So kind of what I think is that Jimmy let Jerry know about it, what he did with Wayne Weaver, the Jaguars. But I think it was Jerry who, spilled the beans and skewered the details a little bit, and told Mike Fisher about it, or the Mike Fisher camp, however it works. And the story gets published in the newspaper. And that's what Jimmy was so upset about, because the facts were bent all out of shape. He didn't, basically throw Norv Turner under the bus and do his own little song and dance here. No, let's deal with the reality here. The Jaguars were searching for a head coach, but this was not a usual head coaching search. The Jaguars were not playing in 1994. They had a whole year to wait and to set things up. So this is a very slow-paced, kind of a preliminary search going on right now. This wasn't a fast-paced search. They were taking their time. They ran through some big names on their list. And Norv Turner wasn't he was one of the hottest assistants, yeah, but he wasn't a landmark name. Let's try to talk to Norv Turner. They're contacting Johnson just seeking for permission, okay? So let's say that they ask, we don't technically know all the details of the conversation between Wayne Weaver and Jimmy Johnson. Let's say that he just asked Jimmy for permission to speak to Turner, and Jimmy says yes. Okay, let's just say he says yes. Okay, go ahead and talk to him. And Jimmy doesn't sell Turner to them. Well, that's not the first time that would ever happen. I mean, let them talk to Turner, and Turner can sell himself. It's not that big of a deal. The Jaguars were still, I don't think that they didn't hire Tom Coughlin until February 20th or February 21st of 1994. So we're still 2 months out from that. Jaguars were not in a hurry about anything. So it's not like this is the usual head coaching query that gets thrown out there. It's kind of, we need to get this done in 2 weeks. Ken, will you talk to Turner now? No, none of that. These are things that I have to consider when reading articles. It's like when Randy Galloway, one of his greatest sources for himself as a writer was Troy Aikman. He would always go to Troy Aikman, and he was kind of a pro-Troy guy. That's just the way it was. So I take that into account when reading about this. He talked to Michael Irvin. Randy Galloway was not one that sucked up to Jerry Jones. Jerry tried to, would talk to Randy and try to get him over to his side, but Randy wasn't going to buy that line. Frank Luxa talked to Jerry too. Frank really wasn't going to buy that line, even though his job with the paper was to be more balanced. Maybe try to balance Randy's negativity out a little bit. But Frank wasn't going to buy it. So that's why Jerry had to go and play his little game with the Star Telegram more often than not to get his side across to the media and to the world and to fans. So when dealing with this Butch Davis story that I'm going to talk about now, what it is, I said in a previous Barry's Boys episode that Butch Davis, one of Barry Switzer's first moves as head coach of the Dallas Cowboys was to kind of broaden Butch Davis's role. Butch Davis was going into his second year as defensive coordinator. He moved to defensive coordinator after Dave Wanstead became the head coach of the Bears. Now, I said that in '94, Switzer made Butch Davis the co-defensive line coach. That he became more of a hands-on with the defensive line, assisting official defensive line coach John Blake. Now, there is an article in the Dallas Morning News that says this. Okay, that says this is what Switzer did. He changed it to this setup. Now, why I'm saying this is not the case is because I've been blessed on this Patreon page to have a former member of the Cowboys who was in the know, who was on the team in 1994. This player was kind enough to reach out to me and message me on Patreon, and was kind enough to answer some questions just about some nuts and bolts stuff, but the inner workings of the Cowboys and some of his own personal experiences. And one of the things he said after I published the video was that that Butch Davis was never in the defensive line room in 1994. That John Blake was the coach in the room, and that's how it was. So how can I, in good conscience, shall we say that this player was right and that the article in the Dallas Morning News was wrong? Here's why. So when this player said this, that Butch Davis was never in the room, I was like, okay. So, and when I researched the issue, I found no other articles corroborating this claim. I found no other evidence that Butch Davis was in the room, was in the defensive line room. And so, what am I saying, that the Dallas Morning News ran a fake story or this or that? No, I'm not saying that at all. What I am saying is that possibly that was the plan from Barry Switzer, but maybe it just didn't work out. There were changes. Jim Eddy he moved from the secondary to the linebackers coach in 1994 for the Cowboys. There was that change, but Butch Davis never went into the defensive line room to handle that. It was Barry Switzer's intention for that to happen. That was what he wanted. Maybe eventually, as they worked through things in the offseason and dealt with responsibilities and so forth, it just wasn't feasible. It wasn't in the best interest of everyone. So that's why I'm saying I'm changing the story that I published, saying that no, Butch Davis actually wasn't in the room, and it was John Blake. So I say all that because there are lots of things to consider. Every article that I come across, it doesn't necessarily mean just because it was published doesn't mean it's 100% correct on either side of the aisle, whether we're talking Star Telegram or the Dallas Morning News. So, and that's one of the things that's not just newspapers. This is the first time I've ever had a former player reach out to me and help me out with stories. And in this case, right here, classic example, he's in basically what the police would consider him an eyewitness on the scene if they're searching for information on a case. And this player he was there. He says, no, Butch Davis wasn't there. And all the newspaper actually said was that Butch Davis was going to be there in the room. Okay. But it never happened for whatever reason. And so in this case, the player, the ex-player of the Cowboys, he helped me arrive at the truth. That's a good thing, because I can sit here and make claims, blah 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 blah. But if I'm not willing to actually prove them and to search them out, search my claims out, even when different people challenge me in whatever way, then I'm not worth my salt. Anything as a researcher, as a storyteller, etc. And so in this case, be glad that somebody in the know reached out and corrected an article that wound up actually not being true. Butch Davis never did become more of a hands-on presence in the defensive line room for the 1994 Cowboys. So anyway, I just thought I'd mention that and make that clear.